Thank you so much, Volker. Yes, and thank you for reminding me of my layers paper from some 22 or 3 years ago now. I was at MCI Communications then. Interestingly, I put that out there because I thought it would be a much better way for the Federal Communications Commission in the US to regulate, right? Regulating based on the layers of the network rather than the silos that had built up over many decades around the services and the kinds of networks the services were supported by. When when MCI was acquired by Verizon, and I was about to move on, they sort of quietly told me it wasn't really in Verizon's best interest to abandon the silos. It was working perfectly fine for them. So thankfully, I moved on to other things, including with Google. Great to be here today. Thanks so much. I'll say so. The glia is the way that as I believe the ancient Greeks would have pronounced. So at least that's the way I pronounce it. So the GliaNet Alliance, um, and I also like it, and I'll get to this in a second because it's the notion of glee is something that we should have more of in the web, not less, and feels like the glee factor is steadily declining. But I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk a little bit about the book, but it's more about really where the book is taking us in terms of hopefully some ecosystem building activities that I've become involved in just in the past 6 months or so out in Silicon Valley. Um, so with that, who is this guy? Richard Whitt. You already gave a very nice intro. I appreciate that. And yeah, the book Reweaving the Web came out late September, and it's available at a few bookstores near you. It's self-published, so I don't have quite the same distribution channels as the larger publishers do, but it is on Amazon and some other places online and a variety of physical bookstores as well. And it's probably apt to point out I'm a public policy lawyer by training, but I've spent the last 10 years now out in Silicon Valley. I went out there when I was in the middle of my stint with Google, and I've stayed. It's a fascinating place. I like to say outside of Las Vegas, Washington, D.C., and Silicon Valley are the two most unreal places in the United States. And every time I go back and forth between D.C. and San Francisco, I'm reminded all the more so. So, what's all this thing about the new book, Reweaving the Web? It's this notion of trying to both look at the challenges, the infirmities of the current web ecosystem, but more importantly, try to give some ideas about how we can make it better. And so, I frankly, even in my latter days at Google, and then I moved on to 3+ years at Mozilla Foundation as a fellow and beyond, as I was writing papers and giving speeches and talking to lots of folks, there seemed to be a pretty well established understanding of what the problems with the web were, but not a whole lot of solutions, not a lot of proposals beyond regulating the platform providers, which seemed to me to be sort of an inadequate way of going, certainly necessary, but incomplete. And so the idea behind the book was let's put a few ideas on the table about how we can perhaps build a parallel ecosystem where people have more control and choice and agency in their connections to the web. I do have to say, since Brett is on here, I've been highly inspired over the years by his work as well, and his book basically on the fact that humans are losing their autonomy even as the machines around us seem to be gaining it every day is well worth the read, and definitely a big inspiration for what I've been trying to work on here. So, what is this thing called GliaNet? Well, first, this is my one stab at what I think the problem is, which is this essentially set of course of parallel feedback loops that I call the seam cycle. So again, this is not anything really new. I'm sort of boiling down things that Shoshana Zuboff and many others have written about over the years. But I try to put it into a way that hopefully ordinary people can find more interesting and even compelling than academic. So SEAM standing for surveillance, extraction, analysis, and manipulation. When I first started talking about this 8, 9 years ago, and I used the term manipulation, I got some pushback from people say, well, that seems a little rough, right? I mean, they're not really changing our behaviors, are they? But I think through work like that Brett has done, what Shoshana demonstrated in terms of her conversations with people at the web companies, manipulation is in fact absolutely the right word in terms of what they're attempting to do, and goes far beyond privacy, right? That's one of my theses here is that using the term privacy, while again, it's important to note that that is a quality that we want to preserve, it is also inadequate because it's really at the core, it's about how we live our lives, what kinds of agency and autonomy we have in our lives every day. Um, and privacy, if anything, is sort of a defensive measure and doesn't really correlate to the need, I believe, for us to have much more control over our daily interactions on the web, not just sort of hiding in the corner, trying to protect our quote, our personal data, but be able to affirmatively be on the web in ways that we find serve our best interests. So the manipulation part is not just about having access to us and trying to sell us things. It really is about altering our behaviors. And AI, of course, is going to make that all the more pronounced. So GliaNet, we talked about it a few minutes ago, ancient Greek word for glue. And I chose it for a couple of reasons. One, there's the old saying, trust is the social glue that binds us as human beings, as communities, as markets, as political systems. No great surprise. We all know that this kind of trust, not necessarily between ourselves as humans, but pretty much all the institutional forms of trust are declining, and even the human-to-human trust is, I think, fraying as the institutions themselves are challenged. The web did not create this problem, but it certainly has exacerbated it, and particularly the human-to-human trust levels that are declining, that show up, of course, in our political systems in particular. So the idea is, how do we bring more authentic trust back to our relationships? There's also this notion of accountability. With great power comes great responsibility. Those in the large platform companies, I would submit, lack that glue, lack that ability to connect those two things together. And then the glial cells in the human brain, which is an interesting story going back to the late 19th century, when the early neuroscientists were first scanning the brain, and they were using the devices that could figure out or could detect the electrical signals coming from the neural networks. So they saw that it was very exciting. They were mapping it out, but then they saw this stuff in between that seemed like inert matter that wasn't really doing anything, and so they basically came up with the term of glial cells because the assumption was these cells were merely gluing together the neurons. What we've, of course, found out over the years, and particularly in the last decade or two, is that glial networks do an enormous amount of things to support the health and operation of the neural networks. And so I like that as well as a connotation for the fact that most of us in our daily interactions on the web, we lack that support. We have really nobody there to protect us, to enhance what we do there, and to promote our best interests. So I really thought that was an additional reason to sort of like using the term glia. So as I came out of Google and started working at Mozilla, I came up with what I call this trust fabric. And part of the reasoning here is that we can't just have a fix at any one particular layer. It has to happen sort of more or less simultaneously across all the different ways that the networks and our own human systems are put together. For example, a technology layer, there oftentimes people talk about creating tech, let's just call the decentralized web, for example, or blockchain, or whatever else you want to fill in the blank. But oftentimes they overlook the other pieces, including how do you govern it? Like, what are the rules of the road? How do you finance it? What's the business model? And then what are the public policy implications? Do you need policy changes to actually make it happen? And so we really need to think about all this stuff holistically. So my proposal around GliaNet goes to all four. At the governance layer, I have a fairly bold pronouncement, which is that if we're using technologies, what I call the D for digital, they should actually enhance us, give us more rights and more capabilities than we have in this so-called analog world. So that's the D is greater than A formulation. And I would submit again that these days, for the most part, our time online, our rights, our abilities, our agencies are declining compared to what we've at least been used to expecting in the analog space. Markets, we need a new kind of marketplace of willing fiduciaries. I'll talk about that in a second. Technology side, the term I've coined is Edgetech. So technologies at the edge, but again, not just sitting at the edge as a matter of how the networks are put together, but also sitting at the edge in terms of where we are as the so-called end users, the customers, the clients, the patrons, the people utilizing the technology that's not hidden behind some screen somewhere, but in fact something that we have direct control over and manipulation abilities over. And then finally, public policy. Are there kind of inputs or incentives we can think about for some of these kinds of innovations? So net fiduciary, what is this? And this is sort of the heart of the governance side of the book. Um, so my thought here goes back, as a lawyer, goes back to the common law of fiduciaries. And we're familiar with, of course, the best examples instantiated in today's societies are medical medical profession, legal profession, certain financial advisors, even librarians exist under fiduciary duties. And the concept, as I've come to understand it from studying this for a while now, is that over periods of time, society in a variety of ways has determined that when there's a power asymmetry between two individuals or an individual and a larger entity, that is when we call upon fiduciary law principles to come into play. So medical doctor is a great example. I go to the doctor, I've got an embarrassing rash. I talk to her, I say, I would like your help with this. You have expertise that I lack. I'm also sharing confidences with you in order for you to help me. And the doctor, of course, will do what she can to do that because she has a duty of care and loyalty towards me as a licensed professional in the United States and in other countries. That's part of the code of conduct that they agree to. There's recourse on the back end if things go wrong. There's an enforcement regime. Licenses can be revoked, things like that. So it's enforceable. It's not just something that is signed up to like terms of service online. It's an actual thing in the world that people rely on. And it then becomes a social norm over time. You go to the doctor, you don't really spend a lot of time thinking about it. You expect that they will abide by these obligations. And so my thought here was that we have that in the again, the so-called analog world, but here we are in the 21st century. We have nothing like that to help us, not just in terms of our data, but in terms of now these AI agents increasingly in the world, and pretty much all of our interactions in the world where the web is touching, which is now increasingly offline as well as online, and things like smart cities, for example. So why not sort of go back to the days of the common law, pull out the principles that seem to make sense, and bring them forward into the web? Now, important consideration here is that there have been people who have talked about this over periods of time. Jack Balkin and Jonathan Zittrain, for example, wrote some articles about 10 years ago about what they called information fiduciaries. Other folks talk about data fiduciaries, and all really interesting, great work. But there's a distinction here that I think is important to highlight. In their case, what they wanted to do was basically apply these duties to the larger platform companies, to the Googles and the Metas of the world, and in particular say that they have a duty of loyalty to us, not as a user but as a customer, and that requirement should be adopted and into law. In the United States, for example, that Congress should pass a law to make that happen. Jonathan has also talked about, well, maybe do some sort of trade-off, maybe around Section 230 rights here in the U.S. versus so you sort of keep your rights as long as you become a fiduciary. Um, Lena Khan, prior to joining the Federal Trade Commission, wrote a counterpiece in which she articulated the reason why she thought that was not a good idea, not because she didn't think that the platform companies required stronger regulation, but because the fiduciary duties imposed by Congress would in fact clash with the fiduciary duties that the folks within the corporations already hold to their shareholders, and in particular the notion of maximizing profits, and that therefore you're sort of creating a clash of duties, and that would likely not be upheld in court. So that I think is a fairly compelling argument. The additional point that I would make here is that Tamara Frankel, who's a longtime expert in fiduciary common law principles, actually has written about this and said the notion of forced, what she calls forced loyalty, is not really loyalty at all. It becomes a compliance regime that the entity that is being compelled to abide by it takes on board and does the minimum necessary to get by. So it's not something that's embraced readily, even eagerly. It is something that is imposed, and that kind of imposition just doesn't work or would not work sufficiently. So I've been persuaded by the idea that this notion of net fiduciary has to be something voluntarily taken on by entities who see it as a benefit to them and to the customers they serve. And we can talk about that more in just a sec. So this is my one summate, my attempt to summarize how you can potentially take some of these principles and apply them in the particulars of the web. And so here, the PEP model is this idea of the protect, enhance, and promote that more or less lines up to the three primary fiduciary principles. The lowest level, of course, duty of care, which the quick summary is no harm. It goes beyond that, of course, but it's reasonable steps to limit the harms that you bring to somebody else. So I call that sort of the guardian role. And the best example of that, I believe, is safeguarding somebody's personal data. So finding ways to protect it, not just in, I would say, not just in the cloud, for example, but keeping it local. That's probably the best way to protect somebody's data. The next level up is the first of the two forms of loyalty. There's the so-called thin form, which basically says to have no conflicts of interest or duties. I retitle that as fidelity, and that's an idea of mediating, a mediating role between you and the world, where you as the individual customer or client are the center point. And mediating news feeds is an example, I think, on the web that makes sense, trying to bring together a news feed that perhaps serves the purposes of the individual. And then finally, the highest is promote, and that is serving as an active advocate. And that highest form of loyalty is about actively promoting one's best interests. The example I would put in here is a term that Doc Searles has utilized, intent casting, which is basically taking my terms of service, for example, and putting them into the web using a browser or some other capability. So it's not me going to websites individually one by one, clicking on boxes or checking off on cookies, but actually that I present my own terms of service, and perhaps through my browser, through some other active agent, it determines whether or not I actually even interact with that website in the first place. So these are sort of, again, three sort of initial ways of thinking about the fiduciary duties and how they could potentially play out in the real world. So here's one model that brings together both the fiduciary and then now the technology layer side. So we have the fiduciary, of course, sitting there in the middle. And then we are in the world of agents. It's clearly happening. And so, and we'll get to this again in a second in terms of how some of this plays out in the context of policy. But what I call the authentic personal AI agent, and the authenticity is the fact that the agent is actually trained by the fiduciary, and that those fiduciary principles of care and loyalty are embedded into the way it operates. So that first and foremost, you as the client are the one that it abides by. You are the one that it's serving essentially, and that then you interact with the other institutional AIs. Bruce Schneier, longtime author, has talked about this more recently. And as he says, the institutional AIs or corporate AIs, whatever term you want to use, they want you to think that their agent is yours. You know, Copilot is a brilliant name. Copilot sounds like I'm sitting in the up there with, you know, in the front of the plane, but in fact I'm not. I'm in steerage. It's Microsoft who controls the Copilot. And so he uses the term double agent. Don't fall for the double agent that is acting on your behalf ostensibly, but in fact is not. And so here the idea is an authentic agency, the agency of working on behalf of you, as assisted by the use of the net fiduciary. So this is in the book, the provisional theory of change around what is necessary to sort of take us from where we are now to a world where we would have this mix of net fiduciaries and other forms of what I call trust mediaries, and these agents, and along the lines of private governance, technology design, public governance, the social fabric. Again, I'll touch on this more in a second, but this is just tries to lay out, you know, in one chart what I think are the things necessary to make this happen. Creating this private governance of companies that want to actually become fiduciaries, technology designs that create these kinds of interoperable personal AI agents, authentic agents, policymakers who enact certain things to, if not compel these, at least maybe create inducements or incentives for these kinds of technologies and governance elements to be in the world. And then in some ways, the biggest, which is the social fabric. We've been trained over time to believe that we have no privacy. It's all over. It's done. Forget it. Move on. And in fact, that's not the case in many ways. But one particular one is the idea that all the information there is about you is in the world. And that's completely untrue. We are always constantly changing and evolving human beings. And I talk about this in the front of the book. And so what they know about what a particular platform company knows about me by information gathered surreptitiously from me is in fact stale the second that they gather it. And it may even be inaccurate, it may be incomplete. And so that apple I bought today online, maybe I bought it because I was giving it to a friend or was trying it out and I didn't like it. They don't know that, in fact, I love oranges much more and I want to buy a bunch of them next week. But if they don't know that information, and in fact, I share that information with a trusted fiduciary, that changes the dynamics quite a bit. And so, one of the things that these companies I'm working with now believe is the case is that over time they will get by building authentic trust, you actually get better quote signals from the person that you're working with, your customer, your patron, about what they want, their intentionalities, particularly the future. That is will be increasingly difficult for the larger platforms to get based on regulation, based on some other constraints that they operate under. So, but people have to first appreciate that they have that ability, that there are, in fact, alternatives to the web as it's grown up. It's not inevitable. It's only been around about 20 years into the current business model. Again, as Doc Searles points out, that's a blink of the eye in terms of how markets form, and there's plenty of other opportunities to develop something else. So finally, I'll just do a little bit here about this new GliaNet Alliance, and then I'm happy to take questions and have a conversation. So after the book came out, I went to a number of smaller startups that I knew in Silicon Valley and a few other places, mostly pre-seed rounds, some early seed round companies. I've been advising a few of them, and I've gathered essentially 20 of them together. The biggest name, I guess, is Consumer Reports, who are working on their own agentic AI system that they want to utilize in the world, and they want to brand as a GliaNet project, which is very exciting for me. So this is an attempt to bring together for-profit companies to demonstrate that there is, in fact, a potentially a healthy marketplace for willing buyers and sellers to get together and for authentic trust to be built, and that trust is the basis for a sharing of quote unquote data. Data, again, I think the book talks about is sort of an inadequate way of talking about, our aspirations, our intentionalities, what we want ultimately for ourselves, for our communities, for our families, our friends. And so what we are working together, we're putting together a community of practice to develop some of these ideas on the governance side. We They are a mix of companies. I'll show this in just a second on the slides. Across basically the larger web ecosystem, AI companies, smart city project, social media platform, number of um, uh, uh, data based companies, a fintech company, things like that. But they all have come together to do the work of building a community of entities who want to become net fiduciaries. And so this is an attempt to sort of show those four layers I showed earlier and how we're trying to work across those. We have a statement of principles. We acknowledge that the current web is pretty lousy. That we embrace ethical business practices based on the ideas of human centricity, the corporate governance elements we've developed that are built on fiduciary principles. We look to collaborate. We seek to design a variety of the elements on the governance side, and that we agree to public endorse. So the 20 companies who've signed up since October have all agreed to this statement of principles. This is the provisional roadmap we've put together. We've more or less gone through phase one and phase two. A lot of this, of course, is work from my book. So I'm very gratified that the folks to this point have signed up and see that as a guidepost moving forward. We're now in phase three, which is the community of practice. So this is, again, looking at the different elements within the ecosystem. How do you check the boxes in terms of having a full appreciation of what it means to be a net fiduciary on the web and in the world? So what is an ethical business model? Obviously is a huge part of that. And we are working together to figure that out. When we get this all together, we're calling it, at least in our heads, Net Fiduciaries Playbook. It would be open source to the extent that we'll make it available to the world. Anybody can take a look at it, kick the tires on it. But part of what we're doing this year is outreach. So as we are developing these things provisionally, we want to, in fact, engage with academics, technologists, policymakers, ordinary citizens to make sure what we're doing here actually seems would in fact make sense and people feel comfortable with it. So it's the business models, it's the external policies, like a privacy policy. It's interesting to say what the first sentence of the privacy policy is, it's your data, not mine. I don't want it. That's different. And what does that look like? And even when you do need to access the data to help somebody, under what terms does that happen? The practices internally to ensure that the policies are put in place, the technical standards, the policy agenda, and then the outreach. And then at the end of the day, then four is the idea of the community practitioners. So it's a code of conduct. It's some indicia of trustworthiness. So it's perhaps trustworthy certification. It's self-regulating organization. It's compliance and enforcement. And then it's ultimately, I think, a government role is necessary, some sort of a backstop. I think here in the States, probably working with the state attorneys general. I've had early conversations in California and in Colorado where maybe you have some sort of a certification around a class of professional fiduciaries that they would help enforce. So sorry. So quickly, one quick policy issue I'll mention is that I wrote a paper about this, and it's also in the book. AI agency, right? Everything is agentic these days. The term is everywhere. So I try to parse it out to say there's actually two ways of thinking about agency, and we're all just sort of focusing on the one that OpenAI and others want us to think about, which is the capabilities to do things in the environment, right? It is adaptable. It is dealing with complex goals. It's in environments that are very sophisticated, and the need for direct supervision is limited. So it's a measure of capability. That's true. That's one thing an agent does, is do things in the world. But the part they tend to overlook is the second piece, which is on behalf of somebody. And the on behalf of somebody, of course, gets back to the notion of a relationship, or in legal terms, a sense of privity between me and the agent slash entity that is providing the agent to me. So OpenAI used the term agenticity. I boldly went out there and decided, okay, well, let's talk about the other side of agency. I call it agentiality. So it's the degree to which the AI agent is authorized to ably represent me. And so that's a measure of relationship. So capability versus relationship. And what I do in the book is I go back to my old friend Clippy from the late 90s. Many of us may still remember he or she. I'm not even sure if Clippy had a gender. But sitting on our computers, Microsoft gave it to us. Clippy basically did nothing of any usefulness as far as I could tell. So that's okay. I was a mere user. It wasn't like spying on me as far as I knew. It wasn't getting access to all my files. Wasn't making decisions for me in the world. I wasn't making reservations at a restaurant I didn't want to go to. It just was pretty minimal. So that to me is sort of ground zero for this notion of trying to tie relationship and capabilities together. And the idea is, as we move up the stack in terms of the capabilities, from just this little bot to some assistant to potentially an autonomous agent, we should expect that the relationship in turn is growing with that. That the healthiest way to think about this is aligning. When you talk about user alignment, this is part of the alignment we should be making, is that the duties, the relationship of a relationship should grow as the capabilities themselves are growing. And as I see it so far, they want to take the minimal amount that Clippy owed us in terms of any kind of relationship and just move that along the bottom bar without thinking too much about the agential side. So finally, last week, the U.S. White House issued their new executive order. Well, I'm sorry, earlier in January they issued their executive order. So the alliance, we got together and put a few pages into the record. We talk about primarily talk about this where we've been currently, which is what I call the platform accountability agenda, which is focused on things like transparency, limited amounts of accountability, risk assessments, and the like, creating the so-called guardrails. And we bring this agenticity and agentiality concept into our comments to say that's all fine, but we should also be focused on human agency. That's a part that seems to be overlooked in pretty much all the conversations. And so if we're doing that, let's talk about two particular pieces that I think are important. One is interoperability between AI systems, which we have already in the web and other technologies. We think some sort of open standards basis with IEEE, maybe with NIST in the US overseeing or being involved would be useful. But right now, we're not talking about interop. We're not talking about ways that these agents and the underlying fabric can talk to each other. And we think that should be part of the conversation. And then, of course, trustworthy intermediaries, which we think are net fiduciaries. And the proposal here is that if an entity is touching my data and or ostensibly trying to make decisions about me, there should be a mandatory duty of care, the lowest level, but still important, like do not harm me standard. And that if the entity, in fact, is doing more than that, then the government hopefully would look towards the voluntary duties of care and loyalty under something like what we're trying to create with the GliaNet Alliance. That sort of two-part approach um, seems to make sense. This is just a quick ecosystem mapping of all the different members of the Alliance, from the content layers in the top to applications, logical layer, and then helpful places at the bottom, which is a smart city IoT deployment working in some major cities in the US and in Europe to build out their systems. And that's who we are. That's me there as the chief GliaNet evangelist. I stole that from Vint Cerf, my friend and peer, who is the chief internet evangelist at Google. So he said, "About okay, if I substituted GliaNet for my own name." And then several folks are working with me. With that, I thank you and look forward to the conversation.